Hi, I'm Gary Wockner, host of Overcoming Overshoot here on EarthX TV. Today, our show is going to dig into the topic of the extreme polarization in Washington, D.C., specifically around environmental issues. At a time when it seems like Democrats and Republicans are constantly at each other's throats and can't agree on anything, we're going to offer a little historical perspective from the not so distant past, where Democrats and Republicans routinely work together to help solve environmental problems. We're going to title this show today, Can Democrats and Republicans Work Together to Protect the Environment? And we have two experts on the topic who used to work together sometimes on a daily and weekly basis in Washington, D.C. First is Pat Wock. Pat has had a long career in political and environmental activism, most recently as a Biden delegate here in Colorado, and before that as the director of the Colorado Democratic Party. Pat has served several presidential administrations working for USAID and as a delegate to the United Nations on the issue of population and development. Pat spent 17 years at the National Audubon Society directing their population and habitat program. Pat, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's nice to be here. Nice to see everyone again.
And our second guest is Claudine Snyder. Claudine is a former Republican member of the U.S. House of Representatives, formerly from Rhode Island, and was still is one of the most outspoken, get this, Republican environmentalists in the United States. Claudine was heavily involved in addressing global warming in the 1980s and introduced one of the first bills in Congress in 1988 called the Global Warming Prevention Act. More recently, as an independent consultant, Claudine has worked extensively in the private and public sectors, working for companies and governments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Claudine, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Honored to be joining the two of you.
What I like to do on the show at the beginning is just a quick, we call it the aha moment. Both of you have had long and illustrious careers working as political and environmental activists. And I wonder, is there one moment in your life or a few months where you said, aha, this is the problem. This is why I want to work on it. Pat, why don't you go first?
You know, I grew up in East Texas and in the woods mostly, which is where I love to spend my time. But I became a nurse, and I think my real aha moment was as a Peace Corps volunteer in northeastern Brazil. And it was working with women who, by the time they were 35, had had at least 21 pregnancies and maybe 10 living children out of that. And they were the stopgap moment on population growth and even on the environment, because instinctively they knew that they had to preserve what they lived on and the resources they had in order to feed their children. And the first time I met one of these women in a clinic, my heart just dropped, because all of a sudden everything came together and I understood that this was the most important issue that we could ever have to deal with in our lifetimes.
Claudine, can you share an aha moment with us?
I think I had a double aha moment, if I might. My first one came when I was 25 years old, and I was told that I had cancer of the lymph system and I had a 50-50 chance of living. Well, I had grown up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and my job every day as a little girl, in order to earn an allowance, I had to dust the house, and it was filthy every day. And we lived near the coke works. And so intuitively, I thought, this cannot be good. Well, by the time I was 25 and given that diagnosis, I was on the brink of getting married. And so it was like running into a brick wall. And I thought, I have been taught that all of us are on this earth for a purpose. I can't possibly die if I haven't had fulfilled purposes yet. And so I kept asking, what is my purpose? What is my purpose? And long story short, all of a sudden, even though I had been interested and studied French, Spanish, and Mandarin, interested in building bridges of understanding and entering the Foreign Service, I ended up running for Congress just out of nowhere. I had no political aspirations, but the doors started to open and I thought, is this my purpose? Surely it will give me the opportunity to connect the dots about the pollution I was cleaning up every day and the impact on human health. And so I basically made it my life's mission to connect the dots between environmental degradation and overall environmental degradation and the impact on human health and on the planet.
Well, those are wonderful aha moments. I've heard a lot of them, and I really appreciate those too. I want to kind of dig right into this issue because, you know, we're all watching what's going on in Washington, D.C., not just, you know, the last couple of weeks, but the last 4 years and even way before that. And the polarization is immense, and especially around environmental issues. You guys used to work together Pat as a Democrat and Claudine as a Republican. So Pat, tell us a little bit about, you know, what was it like in the 1980s in Congress and as being a lobbyist there and also being active in the Carter administration and later, you know, working with Republicans. What was that relationship like and how is it so different than today?
So let me start by saying that I was an appointee in the Carter administration to USAID and started out as a special assistant to Sandra Levin, who you all know as a congressman, but he was one of the bureau chiefs in the Carter administration. And I ended up in the Office of Population, where most of the international assistance comes from, and basically had to work first as the assistant director and the deputy director of this office, which was huge. I mean, we were spending a lot of money, probably minuscule as far as the overall budget's concerned, but for AID, it was a lot. And so my first thing was that I had to oversee a study on population assistance that was requested by Senator Joe Biden, who was on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and worked both with the Congress and the agency to make sure that they understood what we were doing and how it was being done. And so that was my real kind of close-up introduction with the workings of the Congress. I obviously had been politically active before, but I hadn't really worked with members then. In 1985, after the Reagan administration came in, they withdrew my appointment, of course. I ended up at Columbia University at the Center for Population and Family Health, running that center for 3 years. And then Russ Peterson, who some of you will remember, who was a Republican, the governor of Delaware, and actually the head of EPA, the first head of EPA, called and asked me to come to the National Audubon Society to run their population and habitat program. And my reaction was like a lot of people's, this is a bird organization. What do they want to do on population? And his response is, it's all about losing habitat. And who do the birds lose habitat to? But people. How many, where they live, how they live. So, and so part of the big thing was to go to Congress with the environmental voice on population, to meld those issues together. And basically I looked around Congress and I thought, well, there are Democrats that are not going to support this, but there are a lot who will. Who on the Republican side can I talk to? And so there were two people, actually. One was John Porter from Illinois, and the other was Claudine Schneider from Rhode Island. And so one of my entree points, and I don't know whether Claudine will remember this or not, but as I decided to make a film for our chapter activists, we had all these chapters across the country. They wanted something they could use to talk to their members about this intersection of issues. So we made a film called What is the Limit? Looking at population growth. And I wanted to interview members of Congress. So Claudine was one of the members that I interviewed. She was excellent, of course. And John Porter was one. And then we had another congressman from Wisconsin who was a Democrat. Those days, there were really good, solid Republicans who cared very deeply about the environment. And that lasted for a while. In fact, I can remember when some of the legislation was really on the National Biological Survey later on, which Claudia will probably remember, on forests, tropical forests in particular. We could go to those members and talk to them. We tried to talk to everybody. And when you're a National Audubon Society that looks kind of a little more conservative than some of the other organizations and has members in everybody's district, we could at least get that discussion going. And I felt at that point in time, we were very lucky because we had some really good members who cared deeply about what was happening to the world.
Claudine, I bet if you're a Republican member of Congress right now and you wanted to talk to an environmentalist, you'd probably have to go in the basement somewhere and make sure you weren't seen together. You'd turn all the cameras off. It'd have to be a secret. But back then you worked with environmentalists all the time. So, I'm just trying to give people a little bit of feel for what that's like, because I don't think most people nowadays even, can sort of has any concept of what it must be like.
No, it's very sad that most of the young people who are paying attention to the political situation today are using today's situation as a point of reference. The reason I am in enormous pain right now is because my point of reference was from 1980 to 90 when I served. And during that time, there were a group of us, more moderate Republicans, actually 29 of us, and we band together. And our sole guiding light was the question, does this bill, whether it's introduced by a Democrat or a Republican, does this bill represent the best interest of all the people? That was it. That was our measurement. And we made decisions based on that. And at that time, we had the power because there were 29 of us, and sometimes we'd vote with Democrats, other times we'd vote with Republicans. We always voted for what we thought was right. And in the mid-90s, during the Newt Gingrich era, is when that attitude started to change. In 1979, there was a report to Jimmy Carter about the state of climate. And I was on the Science, Research, and Technology Committee. So starting in the early 80s, I started hearing the scientists talk about this could be a very serious problem. Our theories are this and that. And I thought, I have a responsibility as a member of Congress to do something that might be an insurance policy. Even if the scientists are wrong, I think we need to do these actions anyway. So I introduced the Global Warming Prevention Act. And of those 140 co-sponsors that I had, many of them were Republicans. So the bottom line is most of us do not consider the current Republican Party true Republicans because they don't believe in fiscal responsibility, market values, family values. So essentially, as many have referred to them, it's a Trump cult. And just for your information and of your viewers, last Friday, there were over 100 of us on a call who were discussing what is the next move. Do we let this current Republican Party shrivel up and die? Are we a part of it? Do we start a separate party? And I think much will be determined after this second impeachment takes place, because you are either going to see elected officials who stand for truth, for integrity, and for the rule of law, or you're going to see folks who are more interested in power and greed. And the greed is a big piece of why we have not seen more Republican support over the last 12 years for environmental issues.
So can I just add one thing? Claudia, you'd be interested in this. I took some time and looked at the League of Conservation Voters scorecard. And out of all of the House, there are like 4 members who care a little, have voted a little bit. And the one who's voted the most, which is only like 22%, is our old friend, Chris Smith. And in the Senate, there's 1, and that's Susan Collins.
It's abysmal, I know. And people always ask, why are Republicans against the environment. Well, there is the big lie that if we do anything on the environment, like clean up the Flint, Michigan water supply, or if we protect agricultural lands for providing greater productivity for our farmers, they consider all of that to be expensive. It isn't. As a matter of fact, Joe Biden is going to prove that it is not through his Build Back Better program. And the reality is that we have a Republican Party that has been co-opted by the fossil fuel industry. And as a result, it's all about money and power. So when you look at the list of, in the last election, the top 20 Republican senators who received the largest amount of money from the fossil fuel industry, all Republicans. So my motto is always follow the money, pay attention to those elected officials, not just what they're saying, but more importantly, what they're doing. And then where is their money coming from?
One of the things I want to bring up too, and we're going to start talking about some of the issues, climate change, habitat, land protection, population. We might even touch on immigration if we have time. One of the fascinating things is that if you look at public opinion polls, polls of the actual American people, you'll almost see very strong majorities and sometimes overwhelming majorities, over 60%, support legislation or movement on all these issues to try to make them better. But Washington, D.C. is so gridlocked on the whole mess. And so, climate change is a great example. There was a column in the New York Times a few months ago, and it was about the Green New Deal, which I thought was fascinating. And of course, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And there was a quote in the article from a member of Congress who was speaking on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives. And the member said, "We have the facts. The crisis is here. The time to move from rhetoric into action is also here." But that wasn't Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. It was Claudine Snyder in 1988 who said that. Now I'm gonna push back just a little bit on the Republicans are the entire problem thing, and we'll have a nice friendly conversation about it. But Democrats were in charge when Obama and Biden were there, and of course we expected hope and change. And I see the picture right above your head there on your wall, Pat, about hope and change. We didn't get a lot of hope and change. And so it seems it's a bigger problem than just a partisan divide. It's almost like Congress is just stuck in this debilitating place where it can't actually move on the needs of the American people. Pat, what are your thoughts on that?
I think that's really true. And it's interesting because years ago, I did a bunch of focus groups when I first went to Audubon to try to figure out connections between some of these issues that seem so disparate. And I think, and I keep watching the American public. I mean, I'm not only a nurse, I'm a psychologist. So I'm looking at all of these trends. That's what really captures my imagination. What I see happening is the older folks, us, Claudine and me, at least. I don't know how old you are, Gary.
No, speak for yourself, Pat.
but you heard them talking, and they still talk, almost in the fashion of grieving. And I say that because they remember a stream that they went with their grandfather to fish in, which they can't fish in anymore because it's all polluted. Or they remember a lot of open space where they, went walking and finding things they wouldn't normally find. And of course, more and more we become urbanized. And even in the rural areas, we've taken out a lot of that open space. So there's this mourning, and there's a feeling of an inability that this is too big, I can't do anything about it. The young people are waking up. I've looked at a lot of those polls of young people who, regardless of political direction, they get it. So it's the big middle of the country that doesn't want change, that doesn't feel that it's possible to do change, and that likes things the way they are. That's why mental health has been suffering tremendously during this COVID outbreak, because basically because of health situations in my own household. We've been self-quarantined for almost a year now. And so people are just struggling with these issues. And then, if we really want to get political, those people who are running for office have the money and they have the support of the big industrial groups. We talk about oil and gas, which is a huge issue for me right now. And so they're the ones who go into power and they stay in power. There's no limit to that power. So it seems to me that there needs to be a shift, a big shift that has to go on. I mean, Claudine's been doing tremendous work with energy companies, but that shift also has to take place in that middle sector of people, that there is a difference. You don't have to live like this. You don't have to worry about the climate shifting, and you can do something about it. And for me, one of the things I've been struggling with is what kind of experience can we give to people who are members of Congress right now that comes not from me or you, but from local people who live in their district to say, I miss this. The National Biological Survey, for example, in the 90s almost disappeared completely. And one of the studies that was done that said that members of Congress who voted to save it, put it somewhere else, but save it, a large percentage of them had been taken birding by people from their district, so that they'd gone out to see what was out there for the first time. So I think we need to create some kind of experience for members. And then we also have to get to that middle portion of people and say, we're at a strategic point now. This is about, not only your quality of life, but your children and your grandchildren. And there are things we can do. And here are the things. And then help them get those things done. Get them out of this immobility that they're sitting in right now. It's kind of like a depression. Let's get them out of that and say, we can change things. We can change. We will again.
Claudine, one of the links that I shared, and Pat leads us into that, was that polls of young Republicans show that they are much more concerned about environmental issues and climate change than older Republicans. And I'll just add to that, because we're all three from Colorado, and if you follow Colorado voter rolls, you see that more and more young people are registering as unaffiliated. They're not affiliating with either party. And so there's just this, people are just tired of the parties, and they're moving forward in their own, way politically. But especially, it's fascinating that young Republicans are starting to, wake up to the environment, very different than the people who are elected and the people who are older. So, how do you think that could play out, Claudine, and kind of change the face of the Republican Party?
I think that young Republicans in the last elections played a significant role, because for them, climate is front and center. Equality and diversity is front and center. And they're looking at their own futures, wondering, where are the opportunities? Well, it doesn't matter what course of study they're pursuing. It all leads back to climate, no matter how you look at it. So I think that young Republicans and young people in general are a force to be reckoned with. And, the older members of Congress who have been doing the same thing repeatedly will no longer be acceptable. I think that they're going to be tasked to, get out of office or change their ways, because the current situation is unacceptable.
One of the other polls that, I look at every year is from Colorado College. I don't know if you guys follow this poll very much, but they come out with it's a poll of people in the West every year. And every year, it just came out last week, that showed, and they poll about biodiversity, habitat protection, land protection, rivers, flow water in rivers, et cetera. It always shows very strong bipartisan support, usually more with Democrats, but generally above 50% with Republicans too, about protecting public land and the environment in the Western United States, especially and including here in Colorado. So, Pat, again, Why do you think we have so much dissonance where the public is leading with its opinion? The public wants decision makers to do the right thing, and the polls show it constantly, but it continues to be a struggle.
I think it continues to be a struggle because they haven't felt the force really of the voters. I mean, come on, look how much money was spent in this last election. I mean, it is just outrageous how much money was spent in this last election. And so that speaks louder to a member of Congress than it does, a bunch of constituents. If we had, I don't want to get into campaign finance reform, but if we had this kind
Go for it, Pat.
Yeah, I mean, to me, if we had campaign finance reform and we did away with all of these PACs and nobody was allowed except ordinary citizens to give but a certain percentage, and better yet, when I really get into it, is the checkoff. That's what you run on. Whatever money was given through your tax checkup, that's all you have to run on. You'd have a fair and more even field in which voters would be the ones who are choosing. But as long as we have a situation where big money can go in and basically buy elections, I don't think that they care what voters think, quite frankly.
I just want to point something out. Last 2 years ago, the Democratic House passed legislation called HR1, which included policy changes for campaign finance reform, for ethics, a whole broad spectrum of things. The Republican Senate and Mitch McConnell chose not to even look at that bill, along with about 200 or more of additional bills. So when you have a man or woman in power for such a long time who disregards the will of the people and only answers to those who provide money, you're going to get the kind of stagnation we have today. I will also add that there is an organization called Issue One, which is made up of 200 of us former members of the House and Senate, both Democrats and Republicans, who have been advocating and helped to contribute to the policy proposal, HR1, and we will continue to push this because if we want a real democracy, we have to take the influence, the immeasurable influence of money out of our campaigns. It's just out of control.
And what about term limits?
Let's not go there now. Let's get back to climate change and the environment. And I'll give you my short answer on term limits for the House and the Senate. Heavens no. I think that if we had term limits, people would say, like they did to me, oh, Claudine, you're young, why run for the Senate now? You can come back later. No, that's not how human beings do things. And I think term limits will make the voting populace even more lazy, saying, well, they're only there for another 2 years. No, we have to be vigilant as voters and pay attention during the year. And I'd like to add, I had formed an organization of those moderate Republicans that I had mentioned from the House and the Senate 2 years ago, Republicans for Integrity. And we reached out to local newspapers to, in a very didactic way, let them know these are the facts, but this is how your senator voted. And I'd like to think that that had some impact because we can talk as much as we like today, but until we have media and people consuming media that is truthful and focused on important issues, our country is still going to suffer environmentally and in many other ways. Now, I will say to you that I had approached 60 Minutes at one point and said, I'd love to see a program showing all of the renewable energy, energy efficiency, net zero buildings that are being created all around the United States. Just focus on the US. And they weren't interested. People need to know that the technology is here, it's now, we need to start consuming it. And as voters, we need to push our policymakers to embrace them.
One thing you brought up a really important point, Claudine. Of course, so much has been said about this and written about this, but I'd like to get both of your perspectives. We're in this pickle where the media is fed by the number of likes and clicks it gets. And the more outrageous thing you do and say, the more likely you are to get clicks and likes, and the more likely that media is going to get attention to it. So the kind of balkanization is occurring, of course, not just with the political parties, but also with the media. And you almost never see this kind of thing where we have a Republican and a Democrat having a professional, respectful dialogue about issues. And so it's like, I don't know if you have the answer to that one, but, what are your thoughts on how we, get people together and have real conversations rather than just feeding off the polarization that we get from clickbait nowadays?
I would like to just quickly give you a few examples that your viewers can pursue. There's a nonprofit organization called Braver Angels. They're working on this. They're awesome. In addition to that, there are a number of different organizations, including at Colorado University, that are creating programs whereby people will speak to one another. In addition to that, however, there is a book, the title of which is Bombarded by Cyrus Crone, and he looks at social media, which he has been involved in since the beginning of social media, and he comes up with some policy recommendations. One of those I think is very important, and that is for all social media, we ought to have our real names. And then maybe there would be fewer threats, fewer hateful messages being tossed out. And, the local newspapers are having to really struggle right now. And I think one of the most important things that we could do is support our local newspapers, because I believe it's the MacArthur Foundation did some polling which showed that the majority of people trust their local newspapers for political information and other information. So there is real value there.
Well, one of the things I've been very concerned about civil discourse. So one of the things that I did after I left the party was to work with Iliff School of Theology, and we did an event with former Governor Bill Ritter and the late former Senator Bill Armstrong, who was a Republican. And the whole discussion was about civil discourse. How can we talk to each other about issues where we disagree? And it was a very, very good session, but unfortunately, let's just say Iliff decided not to take this on as a program. There is a program out of the Arizona, I believe, called the National Institute for Civil Discourse, who, by the way, is airing a premiere of The Reunited States that is being executively produced by Van Jones and Meghan Markle. And we're actually going to watch that tonight and to see what they come up with. But one of the most disheartening things that I heard from the late Katie Atkinson, who was a Republican political consultant, was that the reason, she said at that time, the reason we do negative ads is because people like them. They work. And so from my perspective, I found that very disturbing. What is going on in the psyche of the country that we respond so positively to negative ads and negative reporting? But I see it on both sides. I mean, I watch MSNBC and sometimes I want to pull my hair out because I feel like they're just kind of stretching things out over the top. And I don't watch Fox News because the few times I've watched it, I know they do it the other way. So if you are a person who is in the middle somewhere and just trying to get information, even getting it from television programs and sometimes from other news outlets, it's very difficult to find non-biased, straightforward facts. And I think it's one of the areas that we need to work very hard to correct. because we can't form a more perfect union, if you will, or heal a world that is struggling right now. Climate change it's got to be the number one issue out there, along with COVID, which is connected, by the way, to climate change. Let's not forget that. And as is a lot of other diseases and more to come. If we're going to do that, we have to find a way that we do sit down, two people from opposite sides of the question, and have a discussion, fact-based discussion about where do we go from here? This is what's going on. We have the power. We're such an interesting species. We have the power to change all of this, but we got to do it together. So what do we do?
We do it. We just do it. I mean, this is not something we leave up to our elected officials only. Dealing with climate begins with every individual in their home, with their family. And I think that it's absolutely essential that we start to imbue in young people the importance of responsibility and critical thinking too, so that they know how to deal with messaging that is, lacking in facts and is inappropriate.
I want to talk about another topic too, which we like to do on this show because it's a topic that a lot of people don't like to talk about, and that is population and population growth. And I know that that's been central to, your careers, both of you, for quite a long time. I'm about 20 years younger than both of you. Now, I won't mention my age, that way we won't mention your age, and no one will know. But I came of age roughly in the late 70s, early 1980s in the environmental movement. And it was the environmental movement that you two and your colleagues created. And at that time, we talked about population growth all the time. It didn't matter if I went to a Sierra Club meeting or an Audubon Society meeting or wherever I went, we talked about population growth. I mean, it was very common in the environmental movement to talk about it. And nowadays, we almost never talk about it at all. And I know, obviously, Pat, you spent a long time in your career dealing with this issue. And so if you can give us any kind of perspective about why we're not talking about it and how we somehow bring it back into the public dialogue, because, I'm with you. I mean, the birds need habitat and the people are taking the habitat. It's like a very simple equation. How do we bring this conversation back forward?
Well, I think, first of all, the birds need habitat, but so do human beings. And if Gary, you've seen, or anybody's seen the book that Ken and I co-edited some years ago, Ken Strom, my husband, called Sharing the Earth, we actually make the point that if we cannot maintain a healthy habitat for other species, then we're not going to do it for ourselves either. Unfortunately, I think the population issue, parts of it have gone on. The part that is focused on the issue of reproductive health, that's not gone away. That's still going on. I've been having a lot of conversations with Chris Tucker. I don't know whether you sent him to me or who, but and I know he's kind of pursuing this. And then I think that we got sidetracked somewhat on that because of the abortion issue, which is a very, very inflammatory issue for a lot of people, and the immigration issue, which is brought in a lot of xenophobia and sort of, fear of people of other colors and all the other kinds of nasty stuff that comes in with it. But the fact of the matter is population growth overall has been slowing. There are success stories out there, but it is like everything else in women's health and men's health for that matter. We still haven't solved a lot of the issues that are related to it. And we certainly haven't taken it in a comprehensive view, which is it's not just the number of people, it's where those numbers are living and how they are choosing to live.
And Claudine, I know that you have been working on this issue for decades yourself on the issue of population. In fact, your global climate change prevention act of 1988 had a population component to it. And so, from your perspective, how do we bring this back into the dialogue, and is there into the public dialogue? And is there any hope in the Republican Party? And I know it sounds like you're working with this dark backroom scene of Republicans, and I won't ask you to out them at all, but you've outed yourself. So is there any way to bring that topic back into the Republican Party, or at least in a way that the public can see it more?
Well, I have a very hard time identifying with what today is called the Republican Party. And I think that there are many of us in that same boat. That's why last week we had our big summit to discuss where do we go from here. But the reality is that there is such a hardened mindset. And as Pat said a moment ago, equating abortion with anything having to do with family planning. What comes to mind, and really was another aha moment, sometimes we take it for granted that everyone knows what we know. And I happen to have been in Nairobi at a women's conference, walking down the street with Bella Abzug and a couple of other women. And this young Kenyan woman had a child on each hip, and she was holding the hand of another child, and she had one on her back. And I'm guessing she probably was no more than 25 years old. And she said to me, "Are you American?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Could you tell me?" And understand, she stops me on the street, a total stranger. She said, "Could you tell me how not to have children?" The fact that the United States fails to provide information on family planning, to me, is totally irresponsible. Just as irresponsible as it is, if I know something that is going to help you in your life, I have a responsibility to share that information with you. And so, I think that at this moment in time, that is such an electric issue that it's one that needs to take a back seat, because the evangelical church, even the Catholic Church, has gotten way too involved in politics and distorting the separation between church and state. And I, as a woman, happen to think that it is nobody's responsibility other than my own to answer to my God, but not to answer to a group of 435 or 535 policymakers. They should not have control over, what I do with my body. So I think that, in introducing that at this moment in time is not going to get us anywhere, but more entrenched and polarized. I think that what can bring us together, however, are steps that we can take on climate, because this is an opportunity for the red states, the farmers, the ranchers to come together. And actually, it is part of President Biden's request of the Secretary of Agriculture that he meet with those folks and to figure out what kinds of incentives they could use to improve their farming capacity. I mean, that's something that I could answer, in a flash. And I mean, regenerative agriculture was part of my bill many years ago. And today the farmers, some of them are putting up wind turbines on their farmlands. Others have the opportunity, because of the drought or the intense sunlight, they can put up solar canopies and actually accomplish two goals of protecting their vegetables and at the same time generating electricity for their communities at a low cost. So there are many solutions out there. Every sector of society, as reflected in my legislation, have a role to play. Now, as we mentioned, money has always come up as, it's going to be too expensive to address climate change. When you have the head of the Federal Reserve say that one of the top risks to the United States economic stability happens to be climate, then Republicans should be paying attention. In addition to that, the chair of the Commodities Future Trade Commission has a subcommittee on climate that Bob Litterman heads. And he and his team have put together recommendations, action steps, but also make it real clear that our whole economy will soon be on the ropes if we don't quickly address climate. And, you know, hopefully most of the people watching this program, Gary, are aware of what those costs will be. We have already spent more through FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Act, in addressing the fires in California, the flooding in the Midwest, the hurricanes, the extreme cold, the extreme drought. This is only going to exacerbate over time if we don't immediately start taking steps. And if anybody feels like, oh, I'm just one person, which is what my staff said to me many years ago, why are you going to do something on climate change? Nobody cares about that. Well, that's what leaders do. Leaders lead. They say this is something we should care about, and we need to lead through example. So the good news is that the private sector has finally gotten on board. I had felt that the auto industry was the least patriotic sector of our economy. And now finally General Motors has said they are no longer going to manufacture cars with combustion engines in 2035, that they will be done. Well, of course, they're saying that also because they need to compete with the European and Asian car companies that are also stopping their manufacturing of vehicles with combustion engines. But could they be more patriotic? Yes. Our post office, thanks to the president that just left, is in total disarray. And their vehicles are in need of upgrade. Should we as taxpayers pay for that? Well, yes, but wouldn't it be wonderful if the auto industry, whom we bailed out years ago, were to say, look, we will provide those vehicles that are either, you know, that are electric vehicles, we will provide those to you. Other parts of the private sector, non-American, unfortunately, like British Petroleum, that is now known as BP, Beyond Petroleum, has committed to turning their real estate of 7,000 gas stations into electric charging stations. So if the private sector is going to make that big move, then certainly other members of the economy can step up and take action too. It doesn't all have to be on government shoulders or on taxpayers' shoulders.
Pat, it looks to me like the Biden administration is going to take this more serious than it's ever been taken before. Now, I remember we heard a lot of this similar rhetoric back when Obama got elected, and you and I were both right there during that whole process. And there was a lot of other things going on. Of course, the economy was crashing, et cetera, but the rhetoric never really turned into reality. And I think you still have a pretty good, your thumb is on the pulse there of the Democratic Party and the machine. Do you feel like this time is really going to be different? And do you see some, consequential changes coming from the Biden administration to lead on the issue of climate?
I think it is different. I do think there's a commitment on the part of Biden himself on climate. I want to make a quick reference back, though. I worked on the Global 2000 study that the Carter administration did. And a lot of people say, well, Carter didn't do anything, but it was very prescient at that point to put out a whole study looking to the future. I'm not sure totally what happened in the Biden administration. I mean, the Obama administration. I do think they got sidetracked on many things they wanted to do because of all of the, look, he inherited an economy that was falling apart. And as far as I can see so far with Biden, the people he's pulling around him really understand this issue. And the fact that he's appointing John Kerry, who totally understands this issue, to be an envoy, and one of his first things is to get back into the climate accord, the Paris Climate Accord, I think are good signs. But he is also inherited some huge issues. COVID, the whole COVID-19 process, which is just horrendous, more horrendous than I think the public really truly understands. The economy, still so many people out there without jobs. So I just think I'm glad to see that somebody's being serious and going forward on this, but I'm really nervous that there's gonna be a lag time. Let's say this, because we have some really critical issues to deal with. I'm glad to see when I get a survey, they say, what's your number one issue? What's your number two? Climate change is always on the list. So we'll just have to wait and see. Claudine, you've been in Washington you were in Washington for weeks before. What did you find out while you were there?
Well, I just want to really emphasize, forgive me, Gary and Pat, but everyone always has a tendency to focus on the president. We have to, when I was first elected, we were told the president proposes and the Congress disposes. The president can create a vision, and we know that he can do many things through executive order. But at this moment in time, we have to remember it is the House and the Senate that really has the power to make substantial, permanent change. And unfortunately, during the Obama years and after that, you had a Republican Party, and I used to pull my hair out at that time because Mitch McConnell was leading the party of just say no. If it was healthcare, Obamacare, it was repeal and replace, started long before the last president, who shall go unnamed. The reality is that we have to scrutinize our House and Senate members and don't just take their politesse as they're paying attention to us, but ask them significant questions. So I think that as Pat mentioned, President Biden has it at the top of his list. He has a million other things to take care of in terms of rebuilding the economy and addressing human health. But he has appointed, the fact that there is now a new national climate advisor in Gina McCarthy, I am expecting great things from her too. And she has a deputy, and the president has also recommended a climate conservation corps. So they've got a lot of ideas that can be implemented without the House and the Senate. Now, Nancy Pelosi, to her credit, has created a select committee on climate in the House. There are numerous pieces of legislation. The key here is the Democrats have a slight majority in the Senate. If they did not, we would get no action.
Right.
So my urging is that we have only 2 years, not a 4-year presidential term. We have 2 years to get significant steps accomplished in the House and through the Senate in order to address climate. And maybe there will be other senators who understand that they must take action. And I want to get back to how do we get them to move? Because Pat, you mentioned something about when you were with the Audubon Society, getting the members of Congress to go on a birding trip. Well, I was leading the fight on the Songus National Forest. And I was outraged that we were allowing clear cutting to take place. Mm-hmm. And there was total lack of information about the erosion that was occurring as a result. And so I met up with a gentleman who had a private plane company. And I arranged to have different former members of members of Congress who were on the relevant committees to get in those airplanes and fly over the clear-cut areas out in the Pacific Northwest. And once they saw it, they came back different people.
So I want to use another example like that, Gary. and it's kind of related, but not totally, but it's the same theme. I live in unincorporated Weld County in Erie, and I am surrounded by oil and gas drilling. I myself, 3 years ago, found that I had a benzene level in my blood that was in the 92nd percentile. And we were having our well checked and all, but it was all, we've decided, coming from the air around us. So one of the things that I did before COVID hit is I invited members of the state legislature and members of Congress to travel with me around and let me show them what was happening, where these wells were, how close they were to schools, playgrounds, and houses. By the way, two of the members of Congress that we got to show around were Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who was here with Joe Neguse, both members of Congress, but we took members of the legislature. The result was that Senate Bill 181, that's making some major changes, not solving everything, but making major changes, got passed. We focused a lot on the Senate. So again, it is, how do we use everyday citizens, and maybe we're not all everyday citizens, but how do we have citizens who have knowledge, who can take leadership? Because I actually also took the head of natural resources and the head of the Colorado Commission on oil and gas. I took everybody I could get out here, little carloads of people, 2 or 3 at a time, and we went from place to place to place to show them that this is not a statistic anymore. This is where people live and how they live, and this is what's happening to them. And I think we have to find that handle, like you talked about, Claudine, with the Tongass. We have to find that handle for population growth. I'm going to stick to that because we have to deal with it, with global climate change, with a lot of the really important issues out there. Because it's one thing to have an aide hand you a piece of paper and say, well, it says such and such and such and such here, and you're supposed to vote that way. It's another thing to ride in a car or fly in an airplane with somebody who has knowledge of the area and show them this is what is happening. That is the task before us. And yeah, I mean, if it's a Republican constituent, because we do have Republican constituents who care about these issues, who can take out a member of Congress and say, just give me a couple hours, let me show you what's happening. Let me take you to that fishing hole that we used to swim in and show you what's happened and why it's happened. I think that's the only way we move these people, because you know what it's like to be in Congress. We know what it's like to be in an organization where you're trying to get something to happen. You get further and further away from what is actually happening on the ground. We can solve this.
Citizen action is absolutely essential, because if you are not making your voice heard, then they're listening to others. And if the others aren't carrying your same message, then we're stuck. Then we're in trouble.
Okay, that is a great spot to kind of wrap things up. We ran out of time here on Overcoming Overshoot. And I just want to highlight again for our viewers that, Pat is a prominent Democrat and Claudine is a prominent Republican. We just had a very respectful, professional conversation about environmental issues, which you almost never see in the United States of America nowadays. So it can be done, and it needs to be done more often. Thank you both for being on the show.
Well, thank you for hosting it, Gary, and for your leadership in bringing such an effort together. Appreciate it.
And thank you for inviting me, and I will do anything with Claudine anytime.
Okay, I'm Gary Wockner here on EarthX TV, and you're watching Overcoming Overshoot.